Imagine standing in the blistering heat of a July afternoon in the year 1099. Before you, stretching across the hills of the Holy Land, a sea of armored warriors glimmers under the unforgiving sun. They are hungry, dehydrated, their skin burned and blistered, but their eyes shine with something far greater than exhaustion: purpose. They are the Crusaders, and before them stands the great city of Jerusalem, a city sacred to Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike, a city they believe has been promised to them by God Himself. But the walls of Jerusalem are high, the defenders determined, and the stakes eternal. This is the story of the Crusaders' siege of Jerusalem, one of the most dramatic, brutal, and consequential moments in medieval history. Over the next 80 minutes, we'll unravel not just the military struggle, but the human emotions, the desperation, and the fervor that drove men across continents for this moment. We'll see what they endured, how they fought, and what it meant for the centuries that followed. So, take a breath, because this journey is about to get intense.
To understand the siege, we first need to understand why it happened at all. The First Crusade began with a call. In 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd at Clermont in France and preached words that would ignite a movement unlike any Europe had ever seen. He painted a picture of Christian brothers and sisters in the East suffering under Muslim rule, of holy places desecrated, of pilgrims attacked on their way to Jerusalem. But Urban's speech was more than a political plea. It was a spiritual lightning strike. He promised something radical, that those who took up the cross and journeyed to liberate the Holy Land would receive remission of sins, eternal salvation. Imagine the power of that promise in a world where heaven and hell weren't abstract ideas but living realities for people. For knights used to shedding blood and endless feudal quarrels, this was a chance to transform violence into holiness. For peasants, it was a chance to rise above their station and be part of a cosmic drama. Tens of thousands answered the call. Some were devout, some were desperate, some were opportunistic. And so began the long march eastward, across Europe, through Byzantine lands, into the heart of the Middle East. By the summer of 1099, after years of marching, starving, and fighting, what remained of this vast army finally reached the walls of Jerusalem.
Jerusalem, at this time, was under the control of the Fatimid Caliphate, a powerful Muslim dynasty based in Egypt. The governor of the city, Iftikhar al-Dawla, was no fool. He knew the Crusaders were coming. The Crusaders had already taken Antioch, had already left a trail of devastation. Jerusalem would not fall easily. The city was fortified with massive stone walls, high towers, and iron gates. The defenders numbered perhaps 7,000 strong, including trained soldiers, archers, and armed townspeople. They may not have had the numbers of the Crusaders, but they had the advantage of defense and familiarity with the terrain. Inside, civilians waited anxiously. Muslims, Jews, even Eastern Christians, ordinary people who had no idea what would become of them if the Crusaders broke through. Now imagine the Crusaders' perspective. They were perhaps 12,000 to 13,000 strong, but many were weakened from years of hardship. Supplies were low, horses were few. They had crossed deserts, endured hunger, and fought battle after battle. Their very survival was in question. And yet, when they saw Jerusalem for the first time, many reportedly fell to their knees, tears streaming down their faces. Some kissed the ground, Others raised their arms to the heavens. After all this suffering, they had finally arrived at the city of their dreams.
The Crusaders wasted no time. In early June, they began to prepare for an assault. But there was a problem: siege equipment. To take a fortified city like Jerusalem, you need towers, rams, ladders, machines of war. And the Crusaders had almost nothing. The land around Jerusalem was barren, stripped of trees by defenders precisely to make construction harder. So the Crusaders improvised. They scavenged wood, broke down old houses, even stripped beams from churches to build siege engines. The first assaults were desperate. Warriors rushed the walls with ladders, trying to climb while arrows and stones rained down on them. Some carried large shields above their heads, forming crude shelters as they pushed forward. But every attempt was repelled. Days turned into weeks. Food grew scarcer. Water was rationed. Soldiers fainted in the heat. Here's an analogy. Think of a marathon runner who's been pushed to the very edge, who can barely stand but sees the finish line ahead. That was the Crusader army, exhausted, battered, but driven by the promise of eternal victory. Still, by early July, morale was cracking. Something had to change.
In times of despair, humans often turn to faith. And so it was at Jerusalem. Leaders called for fasting, prayer, and penance. One chronicler tells us that the Crusaders marched barefoot in procession around the walls of the city, priests singing psalms, the people weeping, begging for divine aid. To the defenders inside, this must have looked bizarre, a starving army circling their city like beggars. But to the Crusaders, it was a renewal of purpose. Soon after, reinforcements arrived with timber, giving the Crusaders the materials they needed to build proper siege towers and engines. Under the leadership of men like Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond of Toulouse, construction began. These were no ordinary towers. Imagine massive wooden structures, several stories tall, rolled on wheels, covered in hides to resist fire. From the top, archers could fire down on the defenders. At the bottom, soldiers could cross gangplanks directly onto the walls. The final assault was about to begin. The decisive attack came in mid-July, 1099. On the 13th, the Crusaders advanced with their great towers. The defenders lit fires, hurled rocks, shot arrows. Flames spread, men screamed, chaos erupted. But the Crusaders pushed forward relentlessly. On July 15th, Godfrey of Bouillon's tower reached the northern wall. Warriors scrambled across the gangplanks, clashing with defenders in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Picture it, steel against steel, screams echoing, the heat of fire mixing with the cries of the wounded, arrows whistling past, the air thick with smoke. And then it happened. A Crusader banner was raised above the walls. The city had been breached. Once inside, the Crusaders surged through the streets. Resistance collapsed, and what followed remains one of the most infamous massacres of the medieval world. Muslims, Jews, even many Christians were slaughtered. Chroniclers describe blood running through the streets, though numbers are debated. The Crusaders saw it not as brutality, but as divine judgment. By the evening of July 15th, Jerusalem was theirs. After 4 years of suffering, they had reached their goal. With the city captured, the Crusaders celebrated with tears and prayers. They went barefoot to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, giving thanks. For them, this was the culmination of God's will. But for the city's inhabitants, it was catastrophe. Entire communities were wiped out, holy places desecrated. Politically, the Crusaders established the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a new Christian state in the heart of the Muslim world. Godfrey of Bouillon refused the title of king, calling himself instead the defender of the Holy Sepulchre. But this victory came at a cost. For Muslims, the fall of Jerusalem was a wound that would not be forgotten. For centuries, it fueled calls for jihad, shaping the history of the Middle East. The Crusades would rage on, wave after wave, long after 1099.
The siege of Jerusalem was more than a battle. It was a clash of faiths, of cultures, of human desperation. It was about men and women pushed beyond the limits of endurance, about the power of belief to drive people to extraordinary and often horrifying acts. When we look back at the Crusaders standing before those walls in 1099, we see more than warriors. We see the complexity of humanity, faith, fear, courage, cruelty, hope, and despair, woven together in one of the most dramatic moments of the Middle Ages. And that is why, nearly 1,000 years later, we still tell the story of the Crusaders' siege of Jerusalem.